The morning light cut through the fog like a blade, revealing the empty driveway where 3 vehicles had been parked just days before. Curtains hung motionless in the windows of the Caldwell house, and the newspaper lay untouched on the porch, soaking up the dawn moisture. Neighbors would later describe a stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the very air had thickened around the property, holding its breath. This was Ridgemont, a town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and silence was sometimes the most expensive purchase of all. In the autumn of 1998, Ridgemont was a town caught between 2 eras, clinging to the simplicity of small-town life, while the outside world rushed headlong into a new millennium. Main Street still had a soda fountain. The library closed at 5. Children rode bicycles without helmets, and front doors remained unlocked until bedtime. The Caldwell family had been woven into the fabric of Ridgemont for 3 generations. Malcolm Caldwell, at 46, was a man of quiet competence, the kind of person people sought out when they needed honest advice about property lines or water rights. He had inherited 47 acres of forest land from his father, land that had been in the family since the 1920s, when his grandfather had purchased it for almost nothing during hard times. Malcolm had worked as a surveyor for the county, a job that suited his methodical nature and love of the outdoors. His wife, Iris, taught piano lessons from their home, and the sound of scales and simplified classics drifted from their windows on weekday afternoons, a soundtrack to the neighborhood. Their children, 17-year-old Devin and 14-year-old Amelia, were unremarkable in the way that most teenagers are unremarkable, which is to say, they were entirely remarkable to those who knew them well. Devin played bass in a garage band that practiced too loudly and dreamed of recording an album that would never materialize. Amelia had recently discovered photography and spent hours in the makeshift darkroom Malcolm had helped her set up in the basement, emerging with chemical-stained fingers and images that captured the melancholy beauty of ordinary things. The Caldwell land had always been just that, land. It sat untouched, except for occasional hunting trips, a buffer between the family and the encroaching development that threatened to transform Ridgemont from a town into a suburb. Malcolm had resisted numerous offers over the years, polite rejections delivered to developers who saw dollar signs where he saw legacy. But in the summer of 1998, something shifted. A development company from the coast, Cascade Holdings, made an offer that eclipsed anything the family had previously considered. The exact figure would become the subject of much speculation in the weeks and months that followed. Numbers whispered in grocery store aisles and coffee shops, each retelling inflating the sum until it reached mythical proportions. What was known, what was documented in the county records office, was that Malcolm Caldwell had accepted an offer and the sale had closed on October 14, 1998. Those who knew Malcolm well expressed surprise at the decision. He was not a man motivated primarily by money, had always spoken of the land as a trust, something to be passed down rather than cashed in. But Iris had mentioned to her sister during a phone call in late September that Malcolm seemed different that summer, preoccupied, staying up late with paperwork spread across the dining room table. There were medical bills, she had said, though she had not elaborated. Devin needed help with college expenses. The roof needed replacing. The practical concerns of middle-class life had apparently outweighed sentimentality. The closing took place on a Wednesday afternoon. Malcolm had driven to the county seat alone, returning home just before dinner with a leather portfolio under his arm. Neighbors reported that the family had seemed in good spirits that evening. Iris had been seen working in her garden the following morning, cutting back the last of the season's roses. Devin had gone to school as usual on Thursday and Friday. Amelia had been spotted at the public library on Friday afternoon, checking out books on advanced photographic techniques. On Saturday, October 17th, the Caldwell family attended an early evening gathering at the community center, a harvest fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. Multiple witnesses would later confirm their presence. Malcolm had bid on a hand-carved walking stick during the silent auction, but had been outbid. Iris had brought her famous apple cake, which had sold out within the first hour. The family had left around 8 in the evening, Iris carrying an empty pie tin, Malcolm with his hand resting lightly on her back, the children trailing behind in that particular teenage way that suggests physical presence without emotional investment. That was the last time anyone in Ridgemont could definitively say they saw the Caldwell family. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline October beauty that makes the Pacific Northwest legendary. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Church bells rang across town, summoning the faithful. The Caldwells did not attend services regularly, so their absence was not immediately noted. But by Monday morning, when Iris failed to show up for her 9 o'clock piano lesson with the Patterson girl, questions began to form. Eleanor Patterson, mother of the disappointed student, had called the Caldwell house 3 times that morning, each call ringing through to the answering machine. By noon, she had driven past the house, noting the drawn curtains and the accumulating newspapers. She had mentioned it to her husband over lunch, who had advised her not to worry, that the family had probably taken advantage of the long weekend to go somewhere. But Eleanor Patterson was a woman who paid attention to patterns, and this break in routine troubled her. By Tuesday morning, when Devin failed to appear at school and Malcolm did not show up for work at the county office, concern began to crystallize into something more substantial. The principal called the house. A colleague from Malcolm's office drove by during lunch. Still the curtains remained drawn. Still the newspapers accumulated. Still no vehicles occupied the driveway. It was Wednesday afternoon, nearly 6 full days after the Caldwells had last been seen, when the sheriff's department received a formal request for a welfare check. Deputy Raymond Mercer, who had known Malcolm Caldwell since they were boys, was the one who approached the front door, knocked with increasing insistence, and finally used the spare key that Iris kept hidden under a decorative stone by the garage. The house was undisturbed. That would become the word that echoed through every subsequent report, every conversation, every theory. Undisturbed. Beds were made. Dishes were washed and put away. The refrigerator hummed quietly, still stocked with food that had not yet spoiled. In Amelia's room, her camera sat on the desk beside a stack of developed photographs. In Devin's room, his bass guitar leaned against the amplifier. In the master bedroom, Iris's jewelry box sat open on the dresser, her wedding ring visible among the modest collection. What was missing were the people themselves and any indication of where they had gone. No suitcases appeared to be absent from the hall closet, though it was impossible to know if the family had owned luggage that was now gone. No obvious signs of struggle or disturbance. No note. 3 vehicles registered to the family: Malcolm's truck, Iris's sedan, and the older model car that Devin drove, were all absent from the property. The investigation that followed would be exhaustive in its procedural thoroughness and ultimately unsatisfying in its conclusions. Financial records were examined. The substantial sum from the land sale had been deposited into the family's bank account. On Friday, October 16th, Malcolm had withdrawn $20,000 in cash, a transaction that raised eyebrows but was not illegal or even particularly unusual for someone who had just closed a significant deal. The remaining funds sat untouched. Phone records showed nothing remarkable: calls to Iris's sister, to the school, to Malcolm's office, to various service providers. The last call placed from the Caldwell home had been on Saturday morning, a brief call to the community center to confirm the start time of the fundraiser. The 3 vehicles were located within a week, abandoned in different locations that seemed deliberately chosen to confound any clear narrative. Malcolm's truck was found in a shopping center parking lot 2 towns away, locked and undamaged. Iris's sedan turned up at a trailhead in the national forest, keys in the ignition, a map of hiking trails folded neatly in the passenger seat. Devin's car was discovered at a bus station in a larger city 40 miles to the north, parked legally in a long-term lot. Each discovery seemed to suggest intentional disappearance, a family that had chosen to vanish. But nothing else supported that theory. Why leave behind wedding rings and treasured possessions? Why abandon vehicles in separate locations? Why withdraw only a fraction of their available funds? And perhaps most troubling, why would a family with deep roots and no apparent crisis simply walk away from everything? The investigation turned to the land sale itself, examining whether the transaction had somehow precipitated the disappearance. Cascade Holdings was a legitimate development company with proper licensing and documentation. The sale price, while generous, was not so extraordinary as to suggest anything illegal. The company's representatives expressed shock at the family's disappearance and cooperated fully with investigators. They had been planning to develop the property into upscale residential lots, a project that would eventually move forward after legal complications regarding the missing family were resolved. Interviews were conducted with everyone who had known the Caldwells, a process that consumed hundreds of hours and yielded little concrete information. Malcolm was universally described as reliable, honest, perhaps a bit reserved, but well-liked. Iris was remembered as gentle, artistic, devoted to her family. The children were typical teenagers, neither troubled nor troubling. No one reported arguments. No one suggested infidelity or addiction or any of the dark undercurrents that often explain sudden disappearances. But there were whispers, the kind that emerge in any small town when something inexplicable occurs. Some neighbors mentioned seeing unfamiliar vehicles near the Caldwell property in the days following the land sale. Others claimed to have heard sounds late at night, though when pressed, they could not articulate what those sounds had been or why they seemed significant. The human mind, desperate for pattern and meaning, began constructing narratives from fragments and shadows. Two neighbors in particular, Vernon and Mavis Whitlock, who lived on the adjacent property and had been friendly with the Caldwells for years, were interviewed multiple times. Their house sat close enough to the Caldwell property that they would have been likely witnesses to any unusual activity, but their statements were frustratingly vague. Yes, they might have seen lights late on Saturday night. No, they could not be sure. Perhaps they had heard vehicles, but it might have been something else entirely. The investigators pressed, but the Whitlocks seemed genuinely uncertain, their memories clouded by darkness and distance and the unreliability of perception. As weeks became months and months accumulated into years, the Caldwell disappearance settled into that particular category of mystery that small towns carry like heirlooms, terrible and precious simultaneously. The house remained empty, maintained by Iris's sister, who drove in from the coast once a month to check on things, to collect mail, to keep the yard from becoming overgrown. The piano fell slowly out of tune. Amelia's photographs gathered dust. Devin's amplifier sat silent. Theories proliferated and evolved. Some believed the family had witnessed something related to the land sale, something dangerous enough to require them to vanish into witness protection, though no evidence supported this dramatic narrative. Others suggested Malcolm had been involved in something illegal, that the family had fled ahead of consequences, though his reputation and the investigation into his affairs revealed nothing suspicious. The darkest theories, the ones spoken quietly if at all, suggested that the family had met with foul play, that their bodies lay somewhere in the vast forests that surrounded Ridgemont, that they had been victims of violence connected to money or land, or secrets that died with them, but without bodies, without evidence of crime, without any clear motive or suspect. The case gradually cooled. The initial intensive investigation gave way to periodic reviews. New deputies joined the sheriff's department, who had not known Malcolm Caldwell personally, for whom the case was just another folder in the filing cabinet. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. Ridgemont changed as all towns change, growing and modernizing, though perhaps more slowly than most. The development that had been planned for the Caldwell land proceeded, and expensive homes rose where old-growth trees had stood, purchased by people who knew nothing of the family that had once held that ground. 25 years is long enough for children to become adults, for adults to become elderly, for the sharp edges of tragedy to wear smooth. But it is not long enough for certain people to forget what they know, what they saw, what they have carried in silence through a quarter-century of ordinary days. And sometimes, for reasons as mysterious as the original disappearance, silence becomes too heavy to bear any longer. The weight of the Caldwell disappearance settled over Ridgemont like snow that never melted, accumulating in layers year after year until it became part of the landscape itself. For those who had known the family, the absence was a wound that refused to heal cleanly, instead forming scar tissue that ached in certain weather, at certain times of day, when certain songs played on the radio, or when October arrived with its particular quality of light. Iris's sister, Catherine Brennan, became the reluctant keeper of the family's memory. She had never lived in Ridgemont, had built her life in a coastal city 2 hours west, but now found herself tethered to this town by obligation and grief. Once a month, sometimes more often in the early years, she made the drive inland, her sedan climbing through the mountains until the trees thickened and the air changed. She would unlock the door to her sister's house and walk through rooms that seemed frozen in time, checking for leaks, for evidence of break-ins, for any sign that might explain the inexplicable. In the beginning, Catherine had cleaned obsessively, unable to bear the dust that gathered on piano keys her sister would never touch again, on photographs her niece would never develop. She washed dishes that were already clean, vacuumed carpets that showed no footprints. But as months became years, she began to leave things more as they were, as if the house itself was evidence that needed preserving. She would sit sometimes at the kitchen table where Malcolm must have sat with his paperwork, trying to understand what desperation or calculation had led to the decision to sell the land, trying to read meaning into the grain of the wood. The financial situation that Catherine inherited was complex and emotionally exhausting. The money from the land sale remained in the family's bank account, accruing interest, legally inaccessible without a court order declaring the family deceased. Catherine petitioned for conservatorship, a legal process that required her to confront the likelihood that her sister and niece and nephew were gone, in the permanent sense, not simply away. The hearings were procedural and devastating, each document another small acknowledgement of loss. Eventually, after 7 years, the standard waiting period for declaring missing persons legally dead, the court granted her limited access to manage the estate. She used the money to maintain the house, to pay property taxes, to fund a private investigator whose efforts yielded nothing new, but whose failures somehow seemed necessary. The private investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Holland, who had moved to Ridgemont after retiring from a larger department, approached the case with fresh eyes and old instincts. He re-interviewed witnesses, examined evidence logs, traced the family's last known movements with meticulous attention. He was the one who discovered that Malcolm had made a series of phone calls to medical offices in the months before the disappearance, calls that seemed to confirm Iris's vague mention of medical bills. Holland tracked down doctors, navigating privacy laws and ethical boundaries, eventually learning that Malcolm had been consulting specialists about a condition that was never definitively diagnosed in the available records. The trail went cold before reaching any conclusion, but it suggested worry, concern about health or finances or future, a crack in the facade of the stable family life. Holland also spent considerable time on the vehicles, examining the logic of their placement. If the family had been planning to disappear voluntarily, why scatter the cars? If they had met with foul play, why would an attacker go to the trouble of moving multiple vehicles to different locations? He developed a theory, never proven but internally consistent, that the vehicles were meant to create confusion, to scatter investigative resources, to make any coherent narrative impossible. But whether that misdirection had been planned by the family themselves or by someone who wished them harm remained unknowable. The detective's final report to Catherine ran to 67 pages, a document that she read once in its entirety and never looked at again. It concluded that absent new evidence, the mystery would likely remain unsolved. Holland had apologized to her in his office, a small room above the hardware store on Main Street where he had set up his practice. He was not a man comfortable with failure, and she could see the case had gotten under his skin the way certain cases do, the ones that remind investigators of the limits of logic and procedure. He had returned half of her retainer, a gesture she appreciated but which somehow made the whole thing feel even more hopeless. In the sheriff's department, the case file grew thick with supplementary reports, periodic reviews, tips that led nowhere. Deputy Raymond Mercer, who had been first to enter the empty house, carried the investigation like a second job for years. He followed up on reported sightings that came in with depressing regularity. The Caldwells allegedly seen in distant cities, in other countries, living under assumed names or suffering from amnesia, or trapped in circumstances that prevented them from coming home. Each lead required investigation, each proved false or unverifiable. Mercer developed a particular expression when discussing the case, a tightness around his eyes that spoke to the frustration of a man who knew something had happened but could not prove what. The initial investigation had made mistakes, Mercer would later admit. They had assumed too quickly that the family had left voluntarily. They had not treated the house as a crime scene in those crucial early days, had not photographed everything, had not collected evidence with the rigor that might have been applied if foul play had been immediately suspected. By the time the investigation shifted toward darker possibilities, whatever evidence might have existed had been contaminated or lost. It was a lesson in the danger of assumptions, in the way first impressions could determine the direction of an entire investigation. Mercer taught about the case at regional law enforcement seminars, using the Caldwell disappearance as an example of what not to do, how to avoid letting the apparent circumstances prevent thorough evidence collection. It was perhaps the only redemption he could extract from his failure to bring the family home. The community processed the tragedy in its own way, through the rituals and mechanisms that small towns use to metabolize grief. There was a memorial service 6 months after the disappearance, held at the community center where the Caldwells had last been seen. The building was filled beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the parking lot. Catherine gave a brief speech, her voice steady until she mentioned her sister's apple cake, that small domestic detail breaking something open inside her. The high school band played because Devin had been part of the music program, though not the band. Someone had assembled a slideshow of family photographs, and watching the images cycle across the screen, seeing the Caldwells frozen in moments of ordinary happiness, felt unbearable and necessary simultaneously. A scholarship fund was established in Devin's name for students pursuing music. A bench was placed at the library in memory of Amelia, with a small plaque mentioning her love of photography and literature. These gestures were inadequate and essential, ways of insisting that the family had existed, had mattered, would be remembered. For a few years, fresh flowers appeared regularly at the bench and on the steps of the empty house. Gradually, the flowers came less frequently, then stopped altogether. Memory is not infinite. Grief competes with the demands of daily life and eventually loses. The house stood empty for 12 years before Catherine finally decided to sell it. The decision came after her own health crisis, a minor stroke that reminded her of mortality and the futility of preservation. She hired a company to pack up the belongings, carefully boxing the piano music and photograph negatives, the bass guitar, and Malcolm's surveying equipment, storing everything in a climate-controlled facility that she paid for in 5-year increments. The house itself sold to a young family from out of state who knew nothing of its history, though the real estate agent was legally obligated to disclose the circumstances. They got it for below market value and seemed unbothered by its past. Catherine drove by once after they moved in, saw children's toys in the yard and new curtains in the windows, and felt something she could not quite name. Not peace, but perhaps permission to let go. The town itself changed in the way all towns change when enough time passes. The soda fountain on Main Street closed when the owner retired and no one wanted to take over the lease. The building became a coffee shop with exposed brick and craft beverages that cost 4 times what a fountain soda once did. The library expanded, adding a computer lab and extended hours. Children still rode bicycles, but now wore helmets, and front doors were locked more often than not. The world had continued its rush forward, and Ridgemont had been pulled along despite its resistance. The generation that had known the Caldwells personally grew older. Former classmates of Devin and Amelia finished college, started careers, got married, had children of their own. At high school reunions, the Caldwells were sometimes mentioned in the way you mention ghosts, with a particular hush, a recognition that their absence was a kind of presence. Some of those former classmates left Ridgemont and never looked back. Others stayed or returned, drawn by the gravity of home or the economics of inheritance. They became the parents and business owners and civic leaders of a town that was simultaneously the same place and completely different. Vernon and Mavis Whitlock, the neighbors who had lived adjacent to the Caldwell property, grew elderly in that house where they had spent their entire married life. Vernon developed diabetes and then heart problems that slowed him considerably. Mavis cared for him with the efficient tenderness of a woman who had never expected life to be easy. They watched the development rise on what had been Caldwell land, large homes with 3-car garages and landscaping that looked imported from somewhere more expensive. The new residents waved politely when they drove past, but rarely stopped to talk. It was not the neighborhood the Whitlocks had known, but then again, nothing was. They spoke rarely about the Caldwells, and when they did, it was in the shorthand of people who have been married long enough that full sentences are unnecessary. Sometimes at night, Vernon would stand at the window that faced toward where the Caldwell house had been, now obscured by the new development, and Mavis would know what he was thinking without asking. The burden of what they knew or thought they knew had been carried so long it had become part of them, inseparable from their other memories, their other secrets, the accumulated weight of a shared life. There had been a night, that last Saturday before the Caldwells vanished, when Vernon had been unable to sleep. It happened more frequently as he aged, his body refusing rest, his mind turning over concerns both urgent and trivial. He had gotten up around 2 in the morning, careful not to wake Mavis, and gone to the kitchen for water. The window above the sink faced toward the Caldwell property, and in the darkness he had seen lights. Not house lights, but the sweeping beams of flashlights or vehicle headlights moving with purpose through the trees that lined the property. He had watched for perhaps 5 minutes, long enough to be sure he was not imagining it, long enough to feel uneasy about what he was witnessing. He had considered waking Mavis, had even taken a step toward the bedroom, but then the lights had gone out. The darkness had returned, complete and unremarkable. In the morning, he had mentioned it to her over breakfast, and she had suggested it was probably Malcolm doing something on his land, maybe showing it to the development company one last time before the sale was final. It had seemed plausible enough. They had agreed it was nothing to worry about, certainly nothing to report. And then the Caldwells had disappeared, and the question of whether those lights had meaning became suddenly terribly significant. When the sheriff's department had interviewed them, Vernon had mentioned seeing lights, but had been uncertain about the details. It had been dark. He had been half asleep. He could not say with confidence how many lights or what kind of vehicles or how long the activity had lasted. Mavis had confirmed that he had mentioned it the next morning, but that they had both dismissed it as unremarkable at the time. The deputies had taken notes, had asked follow-up questions, but without specifics, the information led nowhere. Over the years, Vernon and Mavis had sometimes discussed whether they should have said more, whether their vagueness had somehow hindered the investigation. But what more was there to say? They had seen lights in the darkness. It might have meant everything or nothing at all. As Vernon's health declined, as the very real possibility of death shifted from abstract to imminent, the memory took on new weight. He began to fixate on it during long afternoons when pain medication made his thoughts drift and circle. He would mention it to Mavis, asking if she remembered, asking if they had done the right thing. She always assured him they had told the truth, had reported what they knew. But the truth, she understood, was that they had also protected themselves by remaining vague, by not speculating, by presenting their testimony in the least committed way possible. They were old people who wanted to be left alone, who did not want to be drawn deeper into tragedy or investigation. It had been self-preservation more than deception, but the distinction felt thin. The 25th anniversary of the disappearance fell on a Tuesday in October, the kind of milestone that newspapers and local television stations notice. A reporter from the regional paper drove out to Ridgemont to write a retrospective piece. She interviewed Catherine Brennan by phone, spoke with retired Deputy Mercer, visited the library to look at old articles on microfilm. She knocked on the door of the house where the Caldwells had lived, spoke briefly with the current owners who had nothing to add. She tried to interview Vernon and Mavis Whitlock, but found only Mavis at home. Vernon having been hospitalized the previous week with complications from his heart condition. Mavis stood in her doorway, a woman in her late 70s with careful hair and a manner that suggested she had spent a lifetime being polite to people she did not particularly want to talk to. The reporter asked the standard questions, and Mavis gave the standard answers. Yes, it had been shocking. No, she had no idea what had happened. Yes, they had been good neighbors. The reporter thanked her and turned to leave, then paused and asked one more question. Something about whether there was anything Mavis wished she had said at the time, anything she would want people to know now. Mavis had looked at this young woman, probably not even born when the Caldwells disappeared, and felt the weight of 25 years pressed down. She had thought about Vernon in his hospital bed, worried about dying with this particular knowledge unshared. She had thought about Iris Caldwell, who had brought over soup when Mavis had been recovering from surgery, who had been kind in the unremarkable way that constitutes most human goodness. And she had made a decision that surprised even herself. She had told the reporter to come inside. The article that appeared the following Sunday was longer and more detailed than typical anniversary pieces. It included the usual recap of events, the theories and dead ends, the passage of time. But it also included new information, or rather, old information presented with new specificity. Mavis Whitlock, after 25 years of vagueness, had finally described in detail what her husband had seen that night. Multiple vehicles, at least 2, possibly 3. Activity that lasted for more than an hour, not just passing through but actively doing something on the property. The lights moving in patterns that suggested coordination, purpose. And most significantly, the sound of machinery, like a truck engine running steadily, carrying something heavy. Vernon had not wanted to speculate at the time about what he was witnessing, Mavis explained to the reporter. He had been a man who dealt in certainties, who did not want to make accusations without proof. But in his hospital bed, facing his own mortality, he had told her everything he remembered, had asked her to finally tell someone, in case it mattered, in case after all these years it could still help bring answers. The article included a response from the sheriff's department, a carefully worded statement acknowledging that the case remained open and that all information was valuable. Behind the scenes, however, the new information triggered a review of the case file, a fresh examination of the evidence logs, a discussion about whether anything could be done after so much time had passed. The current sheriff, a woman named Torres who had been in college when the Caldwells disappeared, assigned a detective to review the case. Detective Sarah Chen was young enough to have no personal connection to the family, but experienced enough to understand the challenges of cold cases. She spent 3 weeks reading through files, studying photographs of the empty house, the abandoned vehicles, the property where the Caldwells had lived. She called Catherine Brennan to ask permission to examine the items that had been packed away from the house. She drove to the storage facility and spent 2 days going through boxes, looking for anything that might have been missed. In a box labeled Malcolm's office, beneath survey maps and property documents, Chen found a notebook. It was unremarkable. A standard spiral-bound notebook with a black cover, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. The pages were filled with Malcolm Caldwell's handwriting, a neat and measured script. Most of it was mundane, notes about property boundaries and tree inventories, measurements and calculations. But toward the back of the notebook, in entries dated the week before the disappearance, the tone changed. The notes became more personal, almost journal-like. Malcolm had written about feeling watched, about suspicions that someone had been on the property without permission. He mentioned finding evidence that vehicles had been driving back into the forested sections of his land, tire tracks where no tracks should be. He had written about confronting someone, though no name was given, just a description of an argument about boundaries and rights. The final entry, dated the day before the family vanished, was a single sentence that Chen read multiple times, trying to extract all possible meaning. "Meeting tonight to settle this once and for all." Chen photographed every page and added the notebook to the evidence file. She ran the new information against what was known, trying to construct a timeline that made sense. If Malcolm had confronted someone about trespassing, if there had been a dispute, if a meeting had been arranged, then perhaps the activity Vernon Whitlock had witnessed was that meeting. And if the meeting had not gone as planned, if it had escalated into something dangerous, then perhaps the vehicles and lights and sounds of machinery that night had been the Caldwell family not leaving voluntarily but being taken. The question became what to do with this information. The land had long since been developed, houses built on top of whatever evidence might once have existed. But Detective Chen was thorough and creative. She obtained county records showing the exact subdivision of the Caldwell property, overlaying them with current property maps. She identified which sections had been heavily developed and which might still contain undisturbed ground. There were parcels designated as green space between the houses, areas left wooded to maintain the aesthetic of forest living that buyers were paying premium prices to enjoy. Chen presented her findings to Sheriff Torres, along with a proposal. Ground-penetrating radar technology had advanced considerably in 25 years. It was possible to scan large areas relatively quickly and non-invasively. If something was buried on that property, if the family had never left but had instead been concealed there, modern technology might be able to detect it without disturbing the current residents or requiring massive excavation. Sheriff Torres listened to the proposal, considered the budgetary implications, the media attention it would generate, the expectations it would raise that might ultimately be disappointed. But she also thought about a family that had been missing for a quarter century, about a sister who had spent years maintaining an empty house, about 2 elderly people who had finally decided to speak more fully about what they had witnessed. Sometimes investigations required faith more than certainty, required the willingness to pursue answers even when the likelihood of finding them seemed small. She approved the operation. The scanning took place on a Wednesday in early November, almost exactly 25 years and 1 month after the Caldwell family had last been seen. Detective Chen coordinated with the Homeowners Association, explaining only that the Sheriff's Department needed to conduct a survey of the green space areas. The radar equipment was brought in quietly, operated by specialists from a university research program who volunteered their time for the cold case. They moved methodically through the wooded sections, the equipment sending pulses into the earth and recording what bounced back, creating images of what lay beneath the surface. By late afternoon, they had covered most of the designated search area without finding anything anomalous. Chen began to feel the familiar weight of disappointment, the sense that she had pushed for something that would yield nothing, that would be another dead end in a case composed almost entirely of dead ends. The specialists were packing up their equipment when one of them, a graduate student named Park, noticed something in the data from the final section they had scanned. It was subtle, a disruption in the soil density that might mean nothing, or might indicate that Earth had been disturbed and then settled differently than the surrounding ground. Park showed it to his supervisor, who agreed it was worth noting, but cautioned against over-interpretation. Soil anomalies could result from any number of causes, from old root systems to natural variations in composition. But Chen asked them to mark the location precisely, to provide coordinates and depth estimates. She photographed the area, ordinary forest floor covered in fallen leaves and underbrush, giving no indication that anything beneath might be different. That evening, Sheriff Torres obtained a search warrant. The language was careful, based on the cumulative evidence, the new witness statement, the notebook, the ground-penetrating radar results. It authorized excavation of a specific area, carefully limited in scope but sufficient to determine whether the anomaly was significant. The excavation began the following morning, conducted with archaeological precision, each layer of soil carefully removed and examined. News had leaked despite efforts at discretion, and by midday a small crowd had gathered at the perimeter that deputies had established. Reporters set up cameras. Residents from the development stood in clusters, watching something they did not fully understand unfold in their neighborhood. Catherine Brennan made the drive from the coast, standing silently behind the police tape, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. They found the first evidence just after 2 in the afternoon, roughly 4 feet below the surface, a fragment of fabric, synthetic and partially preserved by the soil conditions. Then more fabric, and then, carefully uncovered by hands wearing gloves and wielding brushes, the unmistakable shape of human remains. The excavation paused while photographs were taken, while the medical examiner was called, while the site was documented with the thoroughness that would be required for whatever came next. By evening, as the light failed and temporary lighting was brought in, they had uncovered multiple sets of remains, positioned in a way that suggested they had been placed rather than fallen, buried with something approaching care or at least method. The identification process would take time, would require forensic analysis and dental records and DNA comparison. But the location, the number of individuals, the approximate time frame suggested by the condition of the remains and the artifacts found with them all pointed toward the same conclusion. After 25 years, the Caldwell family had been found. They had never left Ridgemont. They had been there all along, beneath the houses and walking trails and manicured yards of a development built on land they had once owned, a final resting place they had neither chosen nor deserved. The discovery changed everything and nothing simultaneously. The Earth had given up its secret, but the secret itself raised more questions than it answered. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested that the remains had been there for approximately 2.5 decades, consistent with the timeline of the disappearance. The formal identification process began immediately. Dental records requested from the family's former dentist, who had since retired but maintained meticulous files. DNA samples were collected and sent to the state lab for comparison against reference samples that Catherine Brennan provided. her own genetic material serving as a bridge to her lost sister. While the scientific process moved forward with bureaucratic slowness, Detective Chen focused on the question that mattered most: who had done this? The notebook entries suggested confrontation, but Malcolm had not named his antagonist. The meeting he had referenced, the one meant to settle things once and for all, had apparently been his last act. Chen went back through the investigation files, looking at them now through the lens of homicide rather than disappearance. She compiled a list of everyone connected to the land sale, everyone who might have had reason to want the Caldwell family silenced. Cascade Holdings, the development company that had purchased the property, had long since dissolved. The original partners had moved on to other ventures. The corporate structure liquidated after the development project was completed. Chen tracked down the principals, men now in their 60s and 70s, living in various states. Phone interviews yielded nothing suspicious. They remembered the transaction, but claimed no knowledge of any dispute with Malcolm Caldwell. They expressed shock at the news, offered condolences, provided alibis that were impossible to verify after so much time. One of them mentioned that they had hired a local contractor to do preliminary surveying work before the sale closed, someone familiar with the area who could assess the property's development potential. The contractor's name appeared in the original case file, interviewed briefly at the time as someone who had been on the Caldwell property in the weeks before the disappearance. His name was Dale Garrett, a man who had operated a small excavation and grading business in the area for years. At the time of the original investigation, he had confirmed being hired by Cascade Holdings, had stated that he had walked the property several times with Malcolm's permission, mapping access roads and drainage. He had been cooperative and unremarkable, his statement routine enough that no one had followed up extensively. Chen ran his name through the database and discovered that Dale Garrett still lived in the area, now semi-retired but still maintaining a business license. She drove to his property on a grey morning when low clouds erased the mountains and made the world feel small and close. The address led to a compound at the end of a gravel road, a main house surrounded by outbuildings and equipment, the accumulated infrastructure of a man who made his living moving earth. Garrett answered the door, looking every bit his 71 years, weathered and solid, a man built by physical labor. Chen identified herself and asked if they could talk about the Caldwell case. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name but impossible to miss. He invited her in, offered coffee that she declined, and sat across from her in a living room that smelled of wood smoke and old upholstery. Chen asked the standard questions, establishing timeline and relationship. Garrett repeated what he had said 25 years earlier, that he had been hired to assess the property, that he had met Malcolm several times, that everything had seemed normal. But Chen had learned to listen not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the pauses that suggested calculation. She let the silence extend until Garrett felt compelled to fill it. He had liked Malcolm, he said. Good man. Fair. But there had been a complication. Garrett had discovered something during his survey of the property, evidence that someone had been using a section of the wooded land for purposes that were not exactly legal. He did not elaborate immediately, and Chen did not press, letting him arrive at his own pace. Garrett finally explained that someone had been using the remote sections of the Caldwell property to dump construction waste, avoiding the fees and regulations associated with proper disposal. It was not uncommon, he said. Contractors cutting corners to save money, using private land where they thought no one would notice. Garrett had informed Malcolm of what he had found, and Malcolm had been angry, had wanted to know who was responsible. Garrett had suspicions, but no proof. He had suggested Malcolm not make too much of it, that confronting people over something like this could cause problems. But Malcolm had been insistent, had said it was his land and no one had the right to use it that way. Garrett had tried to dissuade him, But Malcolm had been determined to address the situation before the land sale closed, not wanting to pass the problem to the new owners. Chen asked who Garrett had suspected of the illegal dumping. He was reluctant to answer, claiming it was just speculation, that he could be wrong. Chen reminded him that this was now a homicide investigation, that 4 people had been murdered, that speculation needed to be shared so it could be investigated. Garrett looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from decades of work, and spoke a name: Travis Dutton. Dutton had operated a construction company in the area, Garrett explained, the kind of mid-sized operation that took on commercial projects and residential developments. He had a reputation for underbidding competitors and still turning a profit, which suggested corners were being cut somewhere. Garrett had worked with him on a few projects and had noticed Dutton's casual relationship with regulations and proper procedures. When Garrett had found the dumping site on the Caldwell property, the type of waste suggested commercial construction, and the timeline corresponded with projects Dutton had been working on in the area. Chen asked if Garrett had shared this suspicion with anyone at the time of the disappearance. He admitted he had not, that he had convinced himself it was probably unrelated, that he did not want to make accusations without evidence. But the truth, which he could finally acknowledge after 25 years, was that he had been afraid. Travis Dutton was not someone you wanted to cross. There had been rumors over the years, stories about people who had problems with Dutton finding their equipment vandalized, their permits mysteriously delayed, their reputations damaged by whispered accusations. Nothing you could prove, just a pattern that suggested power and willingness to use it. Chen returned to her office and began researching Travis Dutton. What she found was a story of success that had ended badly. Dutton Construction had grown throughout the 1990s, benefiting from the building boom that had transformed the region. But in 2003, the company had collapsed suddenly, bankruptcy filed amid accusations of fraud and contract violations. Dutton himself had been charged with multiple crimes related to illegal disposal of hazardous materials, building code violations, and financial impropriety. He had been convicted and served 4 years in prison, released in 2008. Current records showed he was still alive, living in a mobile home park in a town 40 miles away, employment history showing odd jobs and long periods of unemployment. Chen obtained an address and drove out the next morning with a uniformed deputy as backup. Standard procedure when interviewing someone with a criminal history in a homicide case. The mobile home was tired and small, its skirting damaged and its steps makeshift. Dutton answered the door looking nothing like the successful contractor he had once been. Prison and the years after had hollowed him out, leaving someone who looked elderly despite being only 63. Chen identified herself and stated she was investigating the Caldwell disappearance. Dutton's face went carefully neutral, and he asked if he needed a lawyer. Chen said that was his right, but that she was just looking for information at this stage, trying to understand what had happened 25 years ago. They talked on his front steps because he did not invite her inside. Chen laid out what she knew: the illegal dumping, the confrontation with Malcolm, the meeting that Malcolm had referenced in his notebook. She did not accuse, simply presented facts and waited to see what Dutton would do with them. He was quiet for a long time, watching cars pass on the nearby highway, and Chen had the sense he was calculating whether truth or denial would serve him better at this point in his ruined life. Finally, he spoke. Yes, he had been dumping waste on the Caldwell property. Yes, Malcolm had confronted him about it, had threatened to report him to environmental authorities and to the county. Yes, there had been a meeting arranged, Malcolm insisting they resolve the situation before the land sale closed. Dutton had gone to that meeting with the intention of negotiating, of offering to clean up the site and compensate Malcolm for the use of his property. He had brought 2 of his employees, men who worked on his crew, for what he claimed was just backup in case Malcolm was not reasonable. The meeting had taken place late on that Saturday night, after the Caldwells had returned from the community center. Malcolm had not wanted his family involved, so they had met on the property, away from the house, near where the dumping had occurred. But the meeting had not gone as Dutton planned. Malcolm had been angrier than expected, had rejected any offer of money or clean-up, had said he was reporting Dutton to every authority he could think of. They had argued, voices raised, and things had escalated. Dutton stopped talking and Chen waited. The deputy stood quietly nearby, hand resting casually near his belt. Chen asked what had happened next, her voice neutral, giving Dutton space to continue. He said that one of his employees, a man named Carl Vickers, had a temper, had taken Malcolm's threats personally. There had been pushing, then actual violence. Dutton claimed he had tried to stop it, but things had happened too fast. Malcolm had been hurt, badly, and suddenly they were looking at something far worse than illegal dumping. Chen asked about the rest of the family. Dutton's face collapsed. 25 years of carrying this weight suddenly visible. He said they had not planned for the family to be involved, but Iris had heard the commotion, had driven out to the property to see what was happening. The kids had come with her. They had seen what had been done to Malcolm. Dutton's voice became barely audible as he explained that Vickers had argued they could not leave witnesses, that they were already looking at serious charges and could not afford to have the family report what had happened. Dutton claimed he had argued against it, but Vickers and the other employee, a man named Russ Hale, had been insistent. He was crying now, tears running into the grey stubble on his face. Chen asked if he had participated in what happened next. Dutton shook his head, then nodded, then covered his face with his hands. He said he had not directly harmed anyone, but he had helped conceal what Vickers and Hale had done. He had used his equipment to dig, to bury, to hide the evidence of that night. He had moved the vehicles to different locations, trying to create the appearance that the family had left voluntarily. He had lived with it for 25 years, the weight of it destroying his business, his marriage, his health, everything he had built. Chen asked where she could find Vickers and Hale. Dutton told her that Vickers had died in 2011, a heart attack that Dutton spoke of with something approaching satisfaction. Hale was still alive as far as Dutton knew, living somewhere in the state, though they had not spoken in decades. Chen asked if Dutton would be willing to give a formal statement, to testify to what had happened. He asked what would happen to him, and Chen honestly told him that she could not make promises, that the district attorney would determine charges, but that cooperation would be taken into account. Dutton nodded slowly and said he was tired of carrying it, that he would tell everything he knew. The arrest of Travis Dutton made regional and then national news. The story had everything media outlets craved. A decades-old mystery solved, multiple victims, a dramatic discovery, and now a confession that led to charges. Dutton was formally arrested and charged with 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and improper disposal of human remains. His statement led investigators to Russell Hale, who was located living in another state under his own name, working as a warehouse manager, apparently having lived with his actions more successfully than Dutton had. Hale was arrested without incident and immediately requested an attorney. He declined to make any statement, but the evidence was substantial. Dutton's testimony, the physical evidence of burial, the notebook entries, the witness statement from Vernon Whitlock about activity on the property that night, all combined to build a case that prosecutors felt confident pursuing. Hale was extradited back to face charges of 4 counts of murder in the first degree. The legal proceedings took months to unfold. Dutton, in exchange for his cooperation, was allowed to plead guilty to reduced charges, receiving a sentence of 15 years for his role in concealing the murders and disposing of the bodies. Given his age and health, it was effectively a life sentence, but the district attorney felt it was appropriate, given that he had not been the one who actually killed the Caldwell family. Hale went to trial, a proceeding that lasted 3 weeks and included testimony from forensic experts, law enforcement, and Dutton himself, who spent 2 days on the stand describing in detail what had happened that October night. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Hale was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence throughout, claiming Dutton was lying to save himself, but the jury had found Dutton's testimony credible, particularly given how much it incriminated him as well. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the profound loss, about a family destroyed over something as meaningless as illegal dumping and wounded pride, about the ripples of harm that extended across 25 years and touched countless lives. Catherine Brennan attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, where Hale would have to see her if he looked, a living reminder of what he had taken. She did not speak to reporters, did not make statements, simply bore witness with a dignity that impressed everyone who observed her. After the sentencing, she gave a brief statement outside the courthouse, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. She said that nothing could bring back her sister, her niece and nephew, her brother-in-law, but that knowing what had happened provided a kind of closure that she had not expected to ever receive. She thanked the investigators, particularly Detective Chen, for their persistence. She said she hoped that Vernon Whitlock, who had died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after finally giving his full statement, knew that his decision to speak had led to justice. The question of burial became the final act of the long tragedy. The medical examiner released the remains after all necessary analysis was completed, and Catherine arranged for a funeral that was both private and communal. The service was held at the same community centre where the Caldwells had last been seen alive, the same place where a memorial had been held 25 years earlier. This time, there were bodies to bury, a concrete end to the uncertainty that had defined a quarter-century. The attendance was enormous, not just people who had known the family, but residents who had moved to town in the years since, people who had bought homes in the development built on Caldwell land, people who felt connected to the story in ways they could not fully articulate. The service was simple, focusing on who the Caldwells had been rather than how they had died. Former piano students of Iris played pieces she had taught them, their adult hands finding the notes she had first shown them as children. Someone had assembled photographs, and the images showed a family in moments of ordinary life. Camping trips and birthday parties, school photos and holiday gatherings, a record of love and normalcy that made their violent end feel even more senseless. Catherine spoke briefly, her voice carrying through the sound system to reach the overflow crowd standing outside. She talked about her sister's kindness, about Malcolm's integrity, about Devin's music and Amelia's art, about the futures that had been stolen. She said that for 25 years she had lived in a kind of suspended state, unable to grieve properly because she did not know what she was grieving. Now, finally, she could mourn and then begin to release. She thanked the community for never forgetting, for maintaining hope when hope seemed pointless, for caring about people who could no longer thank them for that care. The burial took place at the town cemetery on a hillside that overlooked Ridgemont. 4 caskets lowered into earth side by side, together in death as they had been in life. The headstone Catherine commissioned was simple, listing their names and dates, with a single line at the bottom: beloved and remembered. She had chosen those words carefully, wanting to affirm both the love they had shared and her commitment to ensuring they would not be forgotten. In the weeks and months that followed, the community processed the resolution in various ways. There was relief that the mystery had been solved, that justice had been served, but also renewed grief now that the worst possibilities had been confirmed. The development built on Caldwell land became a strange kind of memorial. Houses and families occupying space that had been a crime scene. Some residents moved away, unable to live with that knowledge. Others stayed, feeling that leaving would be its own kind of defeat, that creating homes and lives there was a way of reclaiming the land from what had been done there. Mavis Whitlock continued living in the house she had shared with Vernon. their home now surrounded by the development that had risen on the adjacent property. She had done what Vernon had asked, had finally told the complete truth, and that truth had led to answers. She felt both the relief of unburdening and the guilt of having waited so long. She wondered sometimes if earlier honesty might have led to earlier justice. But Detective Chen had told her not to torture herself with hypotheticals, that she had done what she could when she could, and that was enough. The notebook that Malcolm had kept, the one that had provided crucial evidence, was eventually returned to Catherine. She read through it completely, seeing her brother-in-law's methodical mind at work, his attention to detail, his concern for doing things properly. The final entry, about the meeting that had cost him and his family everything, was heartbreaking in its mundane confidence that problems could be resolved through discussion, that reasonable people could find solutions. Malcolm had not understood that he was dealing with people for whom violence was a viable option, people whose fear of consequences outweighed their capacity for mercy. Detective Chen was promoted to sergeant, her handling of the cold case noted in her personnel file as exceptional work, but she took little satisfaction from the recognition. She had found answers, had brought killers to justice, but she had not been able to return the Caldwell family to the people who loved them. The best she had done was provide certainty and accountability, which mattered but felt insufficient against the magnitude of loss. She kept a photograph on her desk, a copy of one from the memorial service, showing the Caldwells at some family gathering, smiling and whole. She looked at it sometimes when cases felt overwhelming, a reminder of why the work mattered even when outcomes were imperfect. The scholarship fund in Devon's name received a substantial donation from an anonymous source, later revealed to be Catherine, using money from the estate that had finally been settled. The fund expanded, helping more students pursue music education, creating opportunities that Devon himself would never have. The memorial bench at the library was joined by a plaque acknowledging Amelia's photography, and the library began displaying her work in a small, permanent exhibition, images of ordinary beauty captured by eyes that had seen the world with particular sensitivity. Years continued passing, because that is what years do, indifferent to human sorrow or resolution. The generation that had known the Caldwells personally grew fewer. Children who had been born after the disappearance became adults, learning the story as history rather than living memory. Ridgemont continued changing, growing and modernizing, though perhaps it retained something of its small-town character, that sense of interconnection that made tragedies communal and resolution collective. Catherine Brennan made peace with what could not be changed. She visited the cemetery regularly, tending the gravesite, leaving flowers that changed with the seasons. She had survived her sister by decades now, had lived an entire additional life in the time since that October when everything had ended. She sometimes felt guilty for that survival, for the accumulation of experiences and memories that her sister would never have. But she tried to honor Iris's memory by living fully, by being present, by creating meaning where she could. On the 26th anniversary of the disappearance, which was also the first anniversary of the discovery and resolution, the community held a gathering at the cemetery. It was not formally organized, but people came, drawn by shared history and the need for collective acknowledgement. They stood together on the hillside as afternoon lights slanted through autumn trees, and various people spoke informally about memory and justice, about the importance of truth, even when truth brought pain, about the ways communities carry losses and the responsibility to remember those who cannot speak for themselves. Someone brought a portable speaker and played music, pieces that Iris had taught, songs that Devon had loved. Someone else read a poem that Amelia had written for a school assignment, preserved by a teacher who had recognized something special in it. The words spoke of finding beauty in ordinary things, of how light changed throughout the day, of how everything was temporary and therefore precious. It was exactly the kind of observation that photographer would make, seeing the world through a lens that captured what others might miss. As the gathering dispersed and people returned to their vehicles, to their homes, to their lives that continued despite and because of tragedy, Catherine remained at the gravesite. Detective Chen, who had attended the gathering, approached and stood beside her in comfortable silence. They had formed an unexpected connection through the investigation, the detective and the sister, both women who had dedicated themselves to bringing the Caldwell family home. Chen asked Catherine if she had found peace, if the answers had provided what she hoped they would. Catherine thought about the question seriously before answering. She said that peace was probably the wrong word, that she still carried sadness and anger and all the complicated emotions that accompanied profound loss. But she had found something like resolution, a sense that the story had an ending, even if the ending was tragic. She knew what had happened. She knew who was responsible. She knew her sister and her family had not chosen to leave, had not abandoned their lives, had simply been in the wrong place when people made terrible decisions. That knowledge mattered in ways she could not fully explain, but felt deeply. Chen nodded, understanding that some things cannot be articulated completely, that the internal landscape of grief has terrain that cannot be mapped. She told Catherine that working the case had changed her, had reminded her why she had become a detective, not for the satisfactions of solving puzzles, but for the service of bringing answers to people who deserved them. She said she thought about the Caldwells often, wondered about the lives they would have lived, the people they would have become. Devin would be 42 now, probably with his own family. Amelia would be 39, maybe still taking photographs, capturing the world's beauty. Malcolm and Iris would be in their 70s, perhaps grandparents, certainly still contributing to their community in quiet ways. All those possible futures had been erased in a single night of violence and panic, and the waste of it still made her angry. They stood together as the light faded. Two women who had been strangers until tragedy connected them, now bound by shared purpose and the knowledge that they had done what they could with circumstances they never asked for. Eventually, Catherine said she should go, that the drive back to the coast was long, and she wanted to arrive before full dark. Chen walked with her to the parking area, helped her into her car, watched as she drove away. Alone in the cemetery, Chen returned to the gravesite one more time. She had no official reason to be there, no investigative purpose, just a personal need to acknowledge what the case had meant. She thought about all the decisions that had led to this outcome, the choices made by victims and perpetrators, by witnesses and investigators, by time and chance. She thought about Vernon Whitlock finally deciding to speak fully about what he had seen, about his widow following through on his request. She thought about Mavis's courage in trusting a reporter, in believing that 25-year-old observations still mattered. She thought about the graduate student noticing an anomaly in soil density that might have been overlooked. She thought about finding that notebook in a storage unit, about the way small pieces of evidence could accumulate into something substantial enough to support truth. The work of justice was often like this, Chen reflected. Not dramatic revelations, but patient accumulation. Not brilliant deductions, but methodical investigation. Not individual heroes, but collective effort by people who cared enough to persist, despite obstacles and disappointments. The Caldwell family had been served by people who refused to forget, who treated their absence as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be accepted. And while the solution brought no resurrection, while it could not undo harm or restore what had been taken, it did provide something: acknowledgement that what happened to them mattered, that their lives had value, that their deaths demanded accountability. As darkness completed its claim on the day, Chen left the cemetery and drove back toward town, past the development built on Caldwell land, past houses where families lived unaware of or trying not to think too much about the ground beneath them, past the house where Mavis Whitlock sat in her living room, surrounded by memories of her husband and the shared decision to finally speak truth. The lights of Ridgemont spread below, a small constellation in the larger darkness, a community that had been marked by tragedy, but defined ultimately by its response to tragedy, by its refusal to let victims be forgotten, by its commitment to finding answers even when answers required patience and pain. Stories end, but their effects continue, rippling forward through time in ways both measurable and mysterious. The Caldwell family was gone, lost to violence and years, but they remained present in the lives they had touched, in the music students who still played pieces Iris had taught them, in the people who looked at Amelia's photographs and saw ordinary things transformed by attention into art, in the land that Malcolm had loved and tried to protect, in the memory of Devin's quiet dreams of musical success. They remained present in the empty space at family gatherings that Catherine felt every holiday, in the what-ifs and might-have-beens that could never be answered but insisted on being asked. And they remained present in the commitment of a community to remember that 4 people had lived here, had mattered here, had been beloved, and now would not be forgotten. That commitment was perhaps the only justice that ultimately mattered, not the legal proceedings or the sentences handed down, but the decision by ordinary people to hold space for those who could no longer hold space for themselves, to insist on truth and accountability, to transform tragedy into something that taught rather than simply destroyed. In that transformation, incomplete and imperfect as it was, lay something approaching redemption, not for those who had killed, but for those who had survived, who had witnessed, who had cared enough to keep asking questions until questions found answers. The night settled fully over Ridgemont, and in homes throughout town, people went about their evening routines, preparing meals and helping with homework and talking about ordinary concerns, living the lives that continue regardless of tragedy, that honor the dead most fully by fully inhabiting the gift of ongoing existence. And on a hillside at the edge of town, 4 headstones stood in a row, marking earth that held what remained of the Caldwell family, together at last in a place where they would rest undisturbed, remembered, and beloved, their story finally and forever complete.